My name is Catherine Boschman, and I'm the Research Director for the Manitoba Indigenous Tuberculosis History Project. Dr. McCallum couldn't be here today, so I'm stepping in, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the 6th and final lecture in this special series on the history of Indigenous education. This series is sponsored by the Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous People, History and Archives, and is hosted by the Winter 2025 class of the University of Winnipeg students in History 2616, History of Indigenous Education, Residential Schools and Beyond. It's organized by Dr. Mary Jane McCallum and facilitated by the staff here at Studio 1L10 and by Jack Nestor. So in this series, invited guests lecture for about 45 minutes, and then at the end of the formal talk, we'll say goodbye to the folks joining us on Zoom, and then begin a class discussion between our guest speaker and the students here. So I'm very excited to introduce you today to our guest lecturer, Dr. Anne Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay is both an archivist and a historian who has been involved for many years in identifying and honoring children who died while attending residential schools. Her accumulated knowledge on archives associated with Indigenous and settler history is unparalleled in Canada. She has worked for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba, and for the Office of the Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Graves and Burial Sites associated with Indian residential schools. Dr. Lindsay has just submitted a manuscript for her new book that explores the history of fur trade and chattel slavery and is based on her PhD research. As a co-investigator with the Manitoba Indigenous Tuberculosis History Project, Dr. Lindsay has contributed substantially to the creation of a guide designed to support families and researchers who are searching for relatives who were sent to Indian hospitals and sanatoria and never returned home. She is currently working on a similar style of guide for residential school students. The title of Dr. Lindsay's talk today is Challenging Histories, the Search for the Missing Children and Unmarked Burials Associated with Indian Residential Schools in Canada. So Anne, thank you so much for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming out on a snowy day at the end of March as your term is coming to an end. So, over the next hour, we're going to take a brief look at some of the history around 4 sites in Manitoba that contain the unmarked burials of Indigenous children whose deaths are connected to their time in Indian residential schools. If these histories only just scratch the surface of the larger picture of the missing Indigenous children and unmarked burials, they offer some important insights into the challenges of identifying and honoring the lives of the children who died as a result of being taken to these IRSs and protecting their burial places pose. In the process, you may also get some ideas that might help you in your own research. To understand the histories of these sites and the lessons that they can teach us, we'll take a look at 4 IRS, St. Boniface, Rupertsland, Elkhorn, and Brandon, and cemeteries located near Middle Church, which is just north of Winnipeg, Elkhorn, which is located in southwestern Manitoba, St. Peter's Diniver, which is located on the east side of the Red River near Selkirk, and a cemetery located in what's now an RV park on the outskirts of Brandon. We'll take a brief look at the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which is a lot of times we just say IRSA, through the lens of the St. Boniface and Rupertland industrial schools, and discuss why some schools that met the definition of an IRS under IRSA were still not included in the settlement agreement or in its list of recognized schools. We'll touch briefly on the difference between Indian industrial schools and Indian boarding schools, and consider the range of different sources that researchers might encounter in their work, and the importance of never assuming anything by looking at the histories of deaths and burials at the Elkhorn Industrial School. And we'll also discuss the challenges that researchers can encounter when children were moved back and forth between schools and other institutions by looking at pupil burials at St. Peter's Denver Anglican Church Cemetery. Finally, we're going to talk about the importance of hearing Indigenous voices of oral history as a part of research, the importance of remembering that what was lost once can be lost again, and the key role that perseverance plays in research, advocacy, and in honoring the missing children, their lives, their families, and their communities by looking at a cemetery associated with the Brandon Industrial School. Before we get started, we need to talk a little bit about archival research for a minute. Archival research is hard. Archival resources such as arrangement and description rarely point researchers to the file that contains all of the information that they need for a research project. Records can be tucked away in all sorts of unexpected places. One of my favorites is that you need to look in the post office savings accounts files if you want to research, especially early residential school students, but actually really throughout the period. Places that you will only find through a combination of experience and careful attention to the breadcrumbs that may appear in other records, in oral histories, and in the work of other researchers. Once you've found some likely files, archival research can involve countless hours in small, dark, windowless rooms with no one to talk to but the records themselves. It demands a researcher's full attention, hour after hour, as they read through many records that may have little or no relevance to the research question they're pursuing, always mindful that the next page or the next carelessly scribbled margin note may hold the piece of information that they need. Skillful research is not just a matter of identifying potential sources. Skillful research calls for initiative, for historical imagination, for a good basic knowledge of the historical background of the topic that you're researching, and maybe most important of all, the ability to recognize important information when you're looking at it. And that is one of those things that happens all the time, that you read something you don't understand, so you keep going, and then like 5 pages later you go, oh, and you're shuffling back trying to find the darn thing. If you think about the kinds of technological innovations we're seeing in research today, things like AI-enhanced OCR scanning, the focus of these innovations is often to try to circumvent the complexity and the tedium of this kind of work. Used skillfully, these tools can open doors that we might never find any other way, but they are at the end of the day tools. They will never find all instances of every relevant record for us, and they will never replace knowing what keywords might be helpful, what information might be relevant, and perhaps most importantly, how to read and understand the records that they do find in the broader context of the histories that we're researching, how the apparently separate strands that they might help you locate are actually part of a much larger coherent garment. These kinds of tools can create some of their own issues. First among these is the temptation to only read records that the tool identifies. Of course, we can see the danger here of missing records where unusual spelling, poor legibility gets in the way of identifying a record in an OCR search. But there are other risks as well. By focusing on a narrow set of records, we fail to get the broader context the record is located in. Are the 5 records that your AI search has located in a 225-page file actually representative of what this file is telling you? Or are they outliers that may point to another story? Does the aggregation of certain records lead us to see a story that's not actually there? And if this kind of concentration of certain kinds of records can be misleading and can discourage deeper and more nuanced thinking about what is really happening in the records you are looking in, it can pose another risk as well. Depending on the search terms the researcher is using, it can place a concentrated set of distressing records in front of the researcher. Without a little texture in the records, a few mundane or even irrelevant records, this kind of exposure is one of the avenues that can lead to difficult and strong emotions and to vicarious trauma. Whether using research tools such as AI-enhanced OCR or plotting through the records the old-fashioned way, archival research calls on the researcher to keep their head and their higher levels of thinking, to resist the temptation to be reactive as they read through records that can be offensive and distressing. Sometimes these records are shocking, even potentially traumatizing, but even the mundane, the quotidian, the assumptions that the records unself-consciously express over and over again can grind a researcher down. The work of good researching does not stop at the door of the research room. Good research depends on good contextualization and on being able to synthesize what has been found in the archives into coherent, responsible, and thoughtful reporting. Again, while the promise of tools such as AI is to take the work of this away from us, these are only tools. At the end of the day, we're responsible for the content of our reports and must have the depth of knowledge and the time to read and think, to consider and evaluate the research we've done and the report we're writing. Good research is not a collection of impactful records strung together by their capacity to trigger strong emotions. Good research requires depth of historical and contextual knowledge, and depth of thinking. So, why do historical research? It seems almost a truism to talk about the Indigenous right to know, about the importance of good archival research for healing, and the value of good historical research in our pursuit of a more just society. At a professional level, we want to do work that is meaningful and impactful in a good way, both for ourselves and as part of the Academy. We want to make a difference. Done skillfully, carefully, responsibly, historical research can do all of this. It can also be one way that we can contribute to the decolonization of the colonial archive. So we're going to take a look at a little clip here, because I think there are other voices that can say this better than I can.
But it's so nice feeling that I'm in the same area where she's buried after all these years.
Saul Day has been searching for his mother, Doreen Day, for the last 50 years. Now, thanks to the Manitoba Indigenous Tuberculosis History Project, he's found her final resting place in this cemetery in Sioux Valley, Dakota Nation.
As a child, you don't realize what really happened. Sometimes I used to think maybe she found somewhere else to live her life, to carry on. I was hoping that was it. So there was nobody at all to give me any information. So all these years we've been searching. So today I found closure.
She was taken as a TB patient in the early 1950s from her home on the Sandy Lake First Nation in northern Ontario and transported to Nanette.
Yeah, that's good, thanks. You can watch the whole of this video on the Manitoba TB Histories website. It's part of the research guide page. There's another reason for doing this kind of research as well. Research that identifies, traces, and documents the lives of the missing children, their families and communities, and the unmarked burials connected to Indian residential schools contributes to accountability and to our ability as Canadians to take responsibility for our actions and our relationships, to move away from settler amnesty and toward an honest assessment of the structures within our society that not only have, but that continue to inform Indigenous settler relationships today. If the structural impunity of settler amnesty can come in the frank erasure of history, in the destruction of records and the erasure of burial sites, it can also manifest in the reframing of history in a way that downplays the structural roots of issues and harms in favor of a happy narrative of uplift and redemption of the poor Indigenous person or family. Done well, good historical research pushes back against settler amnesty and toward right relationships. If we're asking our research to do all of these things, then it can't be a surprise that good archival research is never going to be as easy as a Google search or a dip into Amazon. Done well, good archival research calls on our ability to work skillfully with discipline, insight, and compassion. To think deeply, to avoid jumping to conclusions, and to practice a nuanced form of self-care that will sustain our work over time, giving us the opportunity to develop the experience that will inform our research going forward, making us better and more effective researchers with every page we turn and every illegible squiggle of handwriting that we try to decipher. So with all of this in mind, let's take a very brief look at just a few of the lessons that the histories of the Rupert's Land, St. Boniface, and Elkhorn Indian Residential Schools, the St. Peter's Denver Church Cemetery, and Brandon Industrial School's First Cemetery can teach us as researchers, starting with the St. Boniface and Rupert's Land Indian Industrial Schools and the history of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, or IRSA. The St. Boniface and Rupert's Land Industrial Schools can be overlooked by researchers if they only focus on the list of schools recognized by the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Focusing only on IRSA-recognized schools in turn leaves important gaps in our understandings of the histories of the Indian residential school system, leaving out the lives, lived experiences, and deaths of the children taken to these institutions. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was a legal solution to the large number of civil suits that were filed by survivors during the late 20th century against Canada and the religious entities that ran the IRS system. During its implementation, the settlement agreement adopted a definition of qualifying schools that was driven by its legal nature. To qualify to be a part of IRSA, a school had to have been under the control of Canada, and children had to have been sent to the institution under the power of the Indian Act to qualify for recognition. Because this was a civil legal agreement, schools that didn't have survivors who were involved in the court actions that led to the settlement agreement were not included in the settlement. One of the reasons that there might be no survivors involved in the court action could be that the IRS closed so long ago that no living survivors were able to participate. This, of course, does not mean that their lives, their experiences, their families, and their communities are not important. The list of schools covered under IRSA is not a complete list of all Indian residential schools in Canada. It's not even a complete list of all the schools that fit the IRSA definition of an IRS for the purposes of the settlement agreement. The St. Boniface and Rupert's Land Indian Industrial Schools are two examples of IRS that met the criteria used to decide whether an institution could be identified under IRSA, or could be included under IRSA, but which are not part of IRSA. So anybody want to guess where the St. Boniface Industrial School was? Pretty close. If you're in St. Boniface and you're going down to Muron, you're kind of driving past where that school was. So right inside what we consider Winnipeg today. It operated between 1890 and 1905. The girls' section was adjacent to the Grey Nuns Convent and Orphanage off Taché Avenue, and the boys' section was located near the Seine River. A small number of the girls lived at the boys' school, receiving some classroom instruction in the evenings after their workday had concluded. It's interesting, too, because the initial group of girls that are included in that first girls' school were actually probably living at the orphanage that was being run by the Grey Nuns at the time. It's very hard to sort them out from the orphanage during most of the school history, but especially in that early period. So it was operated by Catholic entities, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, the Sisters of Charity of Montreal, or the Grey Nuns, and it was overseen by the government of Canada. So if we go on to look at the communities that were impacted, and this research is ongoing. I started doing Indian residential school cemetery research more than a decade ago, and I still find names. New records come up, or somehow you just end up in a record you haven't seen before. But so far, what we have managed to identify in terms of impacted communities include Fort Alexander, Barons River, Long Plains, Black River, Sandy Bay, Broken Head, St. Peter's. We would think of Peguis today. Jackhead, St. Laurent, Manitoba, and these were Métis kids. Roseau River, Fisher River, Hollow Water, Long Plain, Nelson River, Pine Creek, Rat Portage, or Kenora basically, Eagle Lake, Grassy Narrows, Peter Ballendine, Qu'Appelle, Saskatchewan, Piapot, and Pembina, Nietzsche Pembina, North Dakota. So all of those communities have been impacted by the experience of having their kids taken away. Even if it was a long time ago, that experience is still there. Okay. Rupert's Land. So if you are headed going north on Main Street and you cross the perimeter, you're in St. Paul, and you'll see the Middle Church home not very far past the perimeter highway. That's where that residential school was. It became the Middle Church home after it was closed down. It operated between 1890 and 1906. And it was operated by the Anglican Church Missionary Society up until 1894. And then Canada took over the operations, although they kind of remained pretty Anglican, strong Anglican presence there after that. From its beginning, the IRS received the support of the Bishop of the Diocese of Rupert's Land. Publication put out by the IRS, the Aurora, stated that the above school, supported jointly by the government and the church in the Diocese of Rupert's Land, aims at giving a sound religious, moral, and industrial training to Indian boys and girls. So one of the things that we see there is the difference between the Anglican Church and the Church Missionary Society. Even though they're both Anglican, it's going to, when you're doing your research, you're going to have to decide where you're going to look. The archives of the Church Missionary Society will hold records that you're not going to find in the Diocese of Rupert's Land archives. So knowing those kind of granular histories about who was operating things will help you figure out which archives you want to head for. The communities or bands whose children died at or result of being taken to the Rupert's Land IRS include Black River, somebody who is identified in the cemetery record as being born in Lac Seul, so may have been a member of that band. Somebody who was born in Moose Factory, somebody born York Factory, Broken Head, Cumberland, Ebb and Flow, Fairford, Fisher River, Fort Alexander, Frenchman's Head, Grand Rapids, Islington, Lac Seul, Long Seul, Moose Lake, Norway House, Sandy Bay, Shoal Lake, or born Cumberland, again a cemetery record that was a little St. Peter's, the Paw, and White Dog. So interesting number of kids who are being brought in from northwestern Ontario. And that born Moose Factory, born York Factory, a lot of communities in sort of the north, including in Manitoba, were not in treaty early on. And so the communities that get identified in these records aren't necessarily what will eventually be a community that is in treaty, and the records follow under that community name, especially the government records. So some of the children whose deaths we've identified were buried in the St. Paul's Anglican Cemetery across the road from the IRS. If you ever find yourself driving by and you turn down the road between the Middle Church home and the St. Paul's Church, you will find that there is something that's called a lich gate that is still on the property. It was, it's kind of a covered gateway that traditionally it was people who were carrying a coffin into a service would stop there. It was undercover. They could pause and kind of, gather themselves, make themselves look presentable before they went into the church. The particular lich gate that is there was built by residential school students, part of their education. Research indicates that children who died at the Rupert's Land Indian Residential School might be buried at the small St. Paul's Anglican Church cemetery that still stands across the road from the IRS site. There's evidence that the graves of IRS pupils in the cemetery had been marked at one time, probably with wooden markers that have since been lost, and these graves may be concentrated in one part of the cemetery. Other children were buried in the St. Peter's Dinaver Church Cemetery, which we're going to discuss a little bit later on. In some cases, these were children who'd been sent to Dinaver Indian Hospital and died there. In other cases, they may have been buried there at their family's request. One of the consequences of excluding IRS that do not appear on the list of IRSA schools is that this artificially reduces the number of identified pupil deaths. The impact of this is not neutral. Many of the non-IRSA IRSs operated during periods of particularly high mortality. By excluding them, we contribute to settler amnesty by removing disproportionate numbers of deaths. In Manitoba, we'll talk a little bit about industrial versus boarding schools. In Manitoba, 4 Indian residential schools were classified by Canada as Indian industrial schools. These 4 schools were St. Boniface and Rupert's Land, Brandon, and Elkhorn. Children from Manitoba were also sent to schools that operated in other provinces, but we're going to just focus in on Manitoba. Other IRS were classed as Indian boarding schools. For research purposes, and especially when looking for missing children and unmarked burials, there were some important differences between IRS that Canada classed as industrial schools and those they classed as boarding schools. To help understand these differences, let's take a look at the history of Indian industrial schools in Canada. Although Canada already had Indian residential schools much earlier in the late 1800s, the federal government set out to create a number of what it called industrial schools. These were larger schools that were supposed to provide trades and skills training that was not available at smaller boarding schools. Industrial schools initially received more funding from Canada than other IRS did. Importantly, these schools drew pupils from a wide range of communities and were often located at a great distance from these children's homes. These distances could mean that the children who fell ill and passed away at these institutions were more likely to be buried far from home, family, and community. If pupils fell ill, they might not be sent back to their families. When a child passed away at an Indian industrial school, it was less likely that their remains would be sent home for burial. Boarding schools, on the other hand, were smaller and tended to be located on or near reserves and closer to the children's home communities. Because of this, children might be sent home when sick, and parents might be able to bring their child's remains home for burial if they died at the IRS. Excuse me. If a boarding school was located on reserve, it might even share a cemetery with the reserve community. Over time, attitudes about Indigenous people competing in skilled trades put pressure on government officials to change the focus of Indigenous education. This, combined with constant financial constraint, caused the special training offered at industrial schools to fade away, so that the skills work that industrial schools claimed that they offered was eventually not much different from what was offered at boarding schools. Looking to save costs and under a lot of pressure from parents who wanted to keep their children at home, or at least close by, Canada began to move away from the idea of industrial schools in the early 20th century. As part of these changes, both the St. Boniface and Rupert's Land industrial schools were closed. In exchange for closing these institutions, Catholic and Anglican authorities received concessions from Canada. For instance, in exchange for closing the St. Boniface Indian Residential School, the Catholic Church received support to build boarding schools at Sandy Bay, Fort Frances, and Fort Alexander. In this atmosphere, when the Rupert's Land Industrial School was severely damaged by fire in 1906, it was simply not rebuilt. But you can see that even though these schools seem to have operated early and that, they closed, that they are just part of an ongoing history. And so they're not, so old that we don't need to worry about them. They are part of the histories of the communities whose children were taken there, and then part of the histories that go forward in the schools that succeed them. Although it too was considered for closure, in the early 20th century, the Brennan Industrial School, which we'll talk about in a minute, continued to operate into the 1970s. The Elkhorn Industrial School. The Elkhorn Industrial School was spared as well. Originally opened as the Washiketa Home for Girls and the Kasota Home for Boys as part of the Reverend Edward Francis Wilson's network of Indian homes, a project that included the Shinwak and Wawanosh homes in and near Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and another home in Medicine Hat that was constructed but never opened. And he had plans for other places as well. This is a history that is really interesting. If you ever get a chance to pick a project looking into the Wilson family, and it was kind of on the edge of privatizing residential schools. It is a very interesting history. The Elkhorn Indian Industrial School operated from 1888 until 1918, when it was closed and the land and buildings were transferred to the Soldier Settlement Board. The school reopened in 1923 and was closed again in 1949. So here we have a list of the communities, and I'm not even going to read them out. I will let you just have a quick look at that. A list of the communities we've been able to identify so far whose children's deaths are associated with the Elkhorn Industrial School. As with other schools, not all of the children whose deaths are associated with the Elkhorn IRS died and were buried at the school. Some children were sent home sick to die at home, and a number were sent to hospitals or sanatoria, including Diniver and Ninette. If they passed away there, they're more likely to be buried in a cemetery associated with that institution. And we're going to see this as a problem in terms of identifying what's become of students pretty much across the board. Tracing children's lives and deaths after they were sent from an IRS to a hospital or sanatorium can be especially tricky. Children could be moved from one institution to another, sent out for rehabilitation and or work, may have spent years in various healthcare institutions, and may have died some distance from the hospital that they were first sent to. While the work of tracking children sent away sick from IRSs can be difficult, failing to track and account for these lives and deaths contributes to settler amnesty, both by failing to account for these deaths themselves and by missing this important part of the histories these children's stories tell. While, as we have seen in the readings for this week, leaving families looking for answers for generations. Looking at the deaths and burials of children who died at the Elkhorn Institution, many people, most researchers are probably most familiar with the Elkhorn IRS Cemetery that was restored as part of a school reunion in the 1990s. And if you go on Google, there is actually a pin for this. But recent research indicates that the IRS did not own and probably did not have access to the land that this cemetery is located on until about 1898. Suggesting that children who died at the Elkhorn Institution before this date are probably buried somewhere else. While some children may have been buried in home communities or at hospital or sanatoria-associated cemeteries, we know that some children who died at Elkhorn before 1898 were buried by the IRS. Because the IRS did not have the use of the land that the known cemetery is on during these early years, we need to ask where the children who passed away at the IRS before 1898 are buried. So we're going to take a little look at one entry in particular, and it's for Alfred Bear. A register entry related to the death of a child, Alfred Bear, who was from the St. Peter's Reserve near Selkirk, Manitoba, may hold a clue to this question. This register, titled Our Indian Homes, is located at the Shinwalk Archives at Algoma University in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. The register includes the combined records of children taken to both Wilson's Sault Ste. Marie and Elkhorn operations. An entry in this register indicates that when 13-year-old Alfred Bear died in August of 1890, he was buried, quote, at the farm. At the time that Alfred Bear died, the school farm was located a few miles west of Elkhorn and the Elkhorn IRS, which was in town at the time. In 1898, Canada swapped this land, the 640-acre section of the plan that you're seeing. I think we can, sorry, we should have gone. My mistake. We'll see, yeah, that one. Okay. 640-acre section of this plan for the land where the known cemetery is, which is the 320-acre piece. Since this swap, the 640-acre section has been in private hands. With this information, it's clear that further research into the school burials before this land swap is needed. So on to Diniver now, yeah. As we've already discussed, not every child who fell ill at an IRS died at the IRS. While some were sent home sick, others were sent to hospitals and sanatoria. From its earliest days, some of the children who fell ill at Elkhorn were sent to the Diniver Indian Hospital. Opened in 1896, the Diniver Indian Hospital was operated by the Anglican Church until late in 1939. During this time, while Diniver would nominally take patients from any denomination, many of its patients were Protestant. In 1939, when it was taken over by the federal government, hospital became non-denominational. Reopened by Canada in 1940, the Diniver Indian Hospital continued to operate until 1958, when the last of its patients were transferred to the Brandon Indian Sanatorium, and the Diniver Indian Hospital was closed. As we've already seen, children who had been taken to the Elkhorn IRS were not the only pupils who might be sent to the Diniver Indian Hospital or to other medical institutions. Some of the children from the Rupert's Land Industrial School who were buried in the cemetery, St. Peter's Diniver Church, had been sent to the Diniver Indian Hospital where they later died, and children were sent to Diniver from other IRS as well, including from Brandon. In fact, children who passed away at the Diniver Indian Hospital include pupils from Manitoba IRS, such as Birtle, Brandon, Sandy Bay, Elkhorn, Sturgeon Landing, as well as children from northwestern Ontario and Saskatchewan. If they were Protestant, these children were often buried in the St. Peter's Diniver Cemetery. Catholic children may have been buried in a Catholic cemetery in Selkirk, which is, by the way, very hard to track the records down for. But after the 1930s, increasing numbers of children who fell ill at an IRS were sent to medical facilities, including Indian hospitals, sanatoria, and public facilities. When these children passed away, they were more likely to be buried with other patients from the institution where they died than to have their remains returned to their IRS, making the search for missing children and unmarked burials even more complicated. Brandon. While some of the children sent to the Brandon Industrial School may have passed away at a hospital or sanatorium, and a few were sent home sick to die, Brandon's location so far from many of the communities pupils were taken from, and Indian Affairs policy that consistently prioritized cost savings made it inevitable that many of the children who died there would be buried there. In this, the last of the 4 sections we set out to touch on today, we'll take a look at the importance of hearing Indigenous voices, of oral history as a part of a broader and more robust research strategy, the importance of remembering that what was lost once can be lost again, and the importance of perseverance by looking at one of Brandon IRS's cemeteries, a cemetery that's located in what is now an RV park near the outskirts of Brandon, Manitoba. The story of the first Brandon IRS cemetery offers just one example of how critical oral history can be to the search for the missing children and unmarked burials. The history of this cemetery also brings us back to the beginning of this class when we talked about how this kind of research can be hard, and that both research and advocacy require perseverance. Finally, the story of the first Brandon IRS cemetery serves as an important reminder that the work of honoring and respecting the missing children and unmarked burials does not end when a cemetery or unmarked burial is identified. What disappeared once can easily disappear again. I think maybe we could just hop over to the video, and I think it kind of covers everything that we wanted to talk about.
In May of 2021, the world was shocked to learn of the discovery of hundreds of unmarked grave sites along Canada's Indian residential schools. Among the families of residential school survivors, this was already common knowledge. Many stories go untold. There are untold heroes. This is the story of Alfred Alf Kirkness. Alf was born in the Island Lake area of Manitoba in 1902. He entered Brandon Residential School when he was 6 years old, which was later converted to the Brandon Residential School. Alf lived at the Brandon School, leaving briefly to work in Saskatchewan. After returning to Brandon, he worked for the next 38 years in maintenance for the Canadian Department of Agriculture's experimental farm adjacent to the residential school. Over time, the school cemeteries and location were lost due to neglect, overland flooding, and land title changes. His first-hand account of the area's history laid a path for his mission to bring recognition and respect to students buried at those sites and healing to the families.
My name is Lindsay. I'm an archivist and an historian, so I'm trained how to create and operate in archives, and I'm also trained in how to do historical research. And how I became interested in Alfred Kirkness's story was that I was asked to do some research. This was before the TRC even had started, about the cemetery or cemeteries at the Brandon Residential School. We knew that there was one cemetery there, but people were not sure. There were stories that there had been two. And so I started out on that journey just to identify whether there were one or two cemeteries, and if there were two, where this other cemetery would be.
Anne and I were actually students together in the same archival studies class. And this was just one of many projects she's worked on here at the Winnipeg office. A project concerned with properly memorializing the students that died at the Brandon Residential School. We had sort of looked at various files more explicitly associated with the school. Often student deaths will be noted in admissions and discharge files, etc., or in quarterly returns of students that were no longer at the school. She had been working with that kind of material for a few days, and then I sort of expanded the search a bit to look at some land files associated with, well, one was explicitly associated with the school, and a couple others that we were able to find later through association. So I was looking through one afternoon this new file on miscellaneous land matters that I had identified and came across, I think, the first of the Kirkness letters that I'd seen. I could hardly wait till she was able to return just to share my own excitement with her.
So I came in the next day and we opened it up. But even, until we opened that file, we didn't know that it would be this amazing correspondence. We were just hoping it would be something to do with the cemetery.
It's remarkable how he was very strategic in his approach with different letters, and he would try different rhetorical strategies. In some cases, he would, even employ biblical imagery.
Dear Sir, I have seen your field representative and Mr. F. Bond. The impression I got was they did not care. The cemetery are out of sight and one will ever see them. But they did mention adding 2 more wings to the buildings you already have. We build empires of great buildings of stone, steel, and brick. We add wings to buildings we already have. Thousands is spent for people to see what great things the department can boast about. The glory of these things will pass away, but the one thing that men will remember is a cup of cold water given in love. The little things we do for others are the big things we do for ourselves. I'm sure a cup of cold water will be a small price to pay to have these students' remains moved compared to the price the department is willing to spend on building 2 new wings. I am sending in a picture report on the condition of the cemetery north of the school. You will see what I mean when I say, is your school going to be large enough to hide the condition of this cemetery? The cow dung around the cemetery makes great bouquets for the department. Sincerely yours, Alfred J. Kirkness.
The thing that struck us was the sort of persistence and the dedication to the memory of those students.
Another friend and colleague, Claire Cook, joined us, and David and Claire and I worked together to go a little bit into the background of who Alfred Kirkness was and what his own story was, what his reasons for wanting to deal with the cemeteries and his perseverance in doing that. And what we found was just every day a little bit more remarkable. I really just looked forward to the next page. We would not know where that other cemetery was. This is the cemetery that's close to the river. It's the older of the 2 cemeteries, and it was probably abandoned sort of in the 19-teens. So by the time Alfred Kirkness was advocating for both cemeteries, it was invisible. It had just been rendered invisible.
As far as we can tell, he was in contact with the department even before the first letter that is included in a file that we have here in the Winnipeg office. Because the article that we wrote discusses a story in the Brandon paper in which he takes several department officials out to show them where the older cemetery was located. And that newspaper story even frames it as if the conclusion of a long struggle already. That story is in 1963, and the first letter we have is dated from 1964. It just sort of, again, underlines how perseverant he was and how consistent he was in acting as the department's conscience and saying, you should be taking responsibility for this. Somebody should be taking responsibility for this. These cemeteries should not be so poorly maintained and the memory of the students so disregarded. As we know from other records, that he worked for 38 years at the experimental farm immediately next to the residential school that he himself attended. Like since before school age, because his admission form actually, which says he was 6 at the time, notes that he had lived at the school for 3.5 years before that. That he had attended the school himself and no doubt knew the students that were buried in that cemetery. Without ever mentioning that in the letters, it speaks to that sense of humility and the fact that it's the actions that matter, not who he is, but what needs to be done.
Denying children of their identities is a symptom of colonial violence that sustains intergenerational trauma, and so part of that work is to bring healing in that manner and bring justice to light in something that's a really historical wrongdoing. The children from Sioux Valley were sent all over Manitoba. The reason for that is they wanted to break down community. They wanted to break down families. Well, you do that by separating them. They grow up not knowing who their fellow community members are because they're so isolated from each other.
We would like to start that engagement process and working with the relatives and families on how to move this project forward in a respectful way.
Our informal working group consists of members from Sioux Valley, the researchers from Simon Fraser University and Brandon University, and the staff from Agri-Food and Agriculture Canada. The heart of the project is to honor the children who were brought to the school, pay our respects to the families, the survivors, and the communities that are impacted by this school. Within my own family, I have members that went to Brandon, Dauphin, just all over Manitoba.
The Brandon Residential School, we've identified 2 cemeteries. There's one that's close to the Assiniboine River, south of the school, and that was the original school cemetery. And there's a second school cemetery, it's north of the school. And we've also identified 2 locations on the school property, just behind the school. And those are areas that survivors identified that there are unmarked graves. We were able to find some archival records to support that. And the forensic fieldwork also confirmed that there were depressions there. So in total, we actually have 4 areas. Through our efforts to locate all of the cemeteries and the unmarked graves, our total right now is 104 potential unmarked graves. And we've also been actively working to find all of the children's names who passed away at the school. And right now we have a list of 98 children. And that list is ever growing as survivors and family members come forward to report loved ones that also have gone missing and that are not on this list.
I'm a mother, so I've had these kind of difficult conversations. He's really young, but just trying to explain it to him that, you know, he's growing up. I'm teaching him as much Dakota language and about our culture as much as possible, and just trying to explain that the reason we don't speak just Dakota is because of that systemic attempt to erase our culture and our identities.
They don't deserve to be forgotten. How can we keep them alive? How can we pass their stories on? Which is, you know, how human beings have always operated in sort of making sure that there's some continuity with our past that allows us to face the future. And without that connection to the past, I suppose that relates to, you know, why people are motivated to find more about students in the cemeteries. You want to remember them. That's the way human beings keep people they love alive, is by remembering them and talking about them. And to think that people could just disappear is upsetting and distressing for those that did care about them and love them.
I'm really grateful. I'm really proud of the work that Sioux Valley is doing and the work that Catherine has been doing. You know, this past gathering, we had the list of names read aloud in a moment of silence, and that was really impactful. I can't even describe the feelings that I felt at that moment, but I'm very grateful for the work that's being done, and I'm happy I could be a part of it in some way.
So it's only because of the letters and the map, and Alfred Kirkus actually took some people out and, you know, showed them on the land where the cemetery was, that we know where that cemetery is today. If you look at the number of years and the number of times that he wrote a letter explaining the same problem again, and kept his cool through all of that, But I think he was also passionate. I think that he couldn't have stuck with this for the number of years that he did if he didn't care deeply about the problems that he was seeing in terms of basically erasing the lives of these children. So I'll just mention that this documentary was produced by the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Center. And they do some really awesome work, as you can see from this documentary. I encourage you to check out this documentary and other things that they've done. So when the park where the old cemetery is located was changing hands in 2000, the Brandon Sun reported that one of the stipulations of the sale was that the cemetery should be maintained. So I guess I should back up a little bit here and tell you that after Alfred Kirkness had really sort of not only written to government officials, but it had become public knowledge. It was in the newspaper that there was this cemetery. The city of Brandon fenced it, and then the Girl Guides in Brandon took on as a centennial, Manitoba, like 1970 centennial project, maintaining the cemetery. Every year they went there and they put in flowers and they kept it in good shape. So that brings us to when the park where the older cemetery is located was changing hands in 2000, so the city was selling it to a private owner. Brandon Sun reported that one of the stipulations of the sale was that the cemetery should be maintained. Despite this, the older cemetery once more disappeared from view. The cemetery remains unmarked. The work of Alfred Kirkness and the story of the Brandon Indian Residential School cemeteries reveals how important oral history is to the larger research picture, how hard both research and advocacy can be, and underscores the fact that this work is never done. Researching, honoring, and respecting the missing children and unmarked burials associated with colonial projects that include the Indian residential school system is a process, not a goal. It is a commitment. If we lose sight of that commitment, as the story of the first Brandon IRS cemetery shows, the respectful preservation of these sites of conscience cannot be taken for granted. The work of Alfred Kirkness also stands as a reminder of the persistence that's needed in this process. And I think we could end it there.
Thank you so much, Anne, for your talk, and thanks to everyone on Zoom who's joined us today. Thank you for tuning into the lectures and for being a part of this special series. So we'll say goodbye to the folks online now, and we'll take some time to have questions from the class. So see you.